The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
The United States government faces record and ongoing deficits. Some of these have been caused by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as by the Bush tax cut. However, the vast bulk of these deficits come from government obligations as baby boomers begin to retire and trigger dramatic increases in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid payments. Joining us in discussing plausible scenarios for reform is Alan Schick, a professor of political science at the University of Maryland and an expert on the federal budget process. And now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Alan Schick, welcome to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch. But I'm not sure why I even say welcome, because you are a professor here at the university.
Yeah, for 28 years now.
You joined the university after a distinguished career at the Congressional Research Service, and so we're delighted that you're here to talk about the federal and state budget situation. But I should tell our audience about some of the books that you've written, just so they know a little bit about you. And I'm just going to read the list so I get it right. Congress and Money, well, that sounds right. Spending, Taxing, and Budgeting, I would have just said spending, but anyway. Making Economic Policy in Congress, The Capacity to Budget, The Budget Puzzle, these are getting a little less sanguine, I think. And then your most recent, The Federal Budget, Politics, Policy, and Process, and I'm holding the third edition of this wonderful book, which we use to teach here at the university and around the country. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Well, I don't think it's a surprise to our viewers to say that the federal budget seems to have a dismal outlook. We have large deficits, as they used to say, as far as the eye can see. How bad is the situation? How would you describe it?
The situation is bad in two ways. In the short term, because we have a deficit which is likely to exceed $500 billion a year. And in the long term, because we have the aging of the population, which will boost the deficit in the future even higher.
Everyone has their own idea of what causes the deficit. Let's get a few things off the table. Is it the defense establishment? Is that what's causing these large deficits?
Of course, defense makes a contribution, but it's small. Defense spending today is only about 1/6 of the federal budget. When Kennedy became president, it was 1/2 of the budget. So it's receded in importance, and that's even during the fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan.
So what is creating these giant deficits?
Two things, principally. One is entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and dozens of others, which establish a legal right to payment from the government. The government has to make those payments even if it's broke. And the second reason is that we've had tax cuts at the same time that we're fighting a war and facing this demographic deluge.
So we're spending more, and over time we'll be spending even much more. And we're not taxing enough for that level, if we should tax at that level.
That's a good way of putting it.
Well, you've written that there used to be a norm for balanced budgeting. What was that norm, and then what happened to it?
The norm wasn't written in the Constitution or even in law. It was simply the notion that in good times, government should not spend more than it took in.
That must have been a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. The government sometimes violated, but the violations tended to be small. Okay, that concept of a balanced budget went by the wayside when governments, not only the United States but around the world, came to the conclusion that it's more important to balance the economy than to balance the budget.
This is Keynesianism.
This is Keynesian doctrine, popular in the 1960s and beyond, and we've never really completely washed it out of our system.
I read an article where you said that, and I want to ask you to amplify it a little bit in the following way. If we think about what are the major factors in the deficits that are growing. It's not so much this countercyclical special spending. If it's Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, those aren't things that the politicians rev up when the economy is weak. Those things, it's year in and year out. So something else must have happened besides just countercyclical funding.
Yeah, the main thing that happened is a shift in risk from households principally and even to enterprises, the government. Government holds the risk if you're unemployed, if you're disabled, if you get old, if you're ill, all the things that create a financial burden. We've shifted those burdens to the government. And to tell you the truth, a lot of good things have happened because of those shifts, but also a bad thing. And that is the government is left holding a bag whether it can afford to or not.
Well, some of these transfers, I have to say, from a distance, I'm not that close to retirement, but from a distance, it does look as if the government's going to give me a bunch of money, not nearly as much as I put in, but that's a different story. But it's not going to ask me how much money I have in the bank. It's not going to ask me to sell my house. There's something seems a little wrong with that picture.
Politically, it's right, however. These are universal benefits. And universality is important to build political support for them. Every working American can join Social Security, is eligible for Medicare. Every poor American is eligible for Medicaid. The notion of means testing the major entitlements is something which might happen in the future, but in the past we regarded it as the right thing to do, that every American should receive these benefits.
Well, you say might happen in the future, but as I understand your proposals and almost everyone else's, without some form of means testing, without some sort of trimming for the people who can afford to have their benefits trimmed, we never get out of this box, do we?
Well, we've taken a few small steps toward means testing. In Social Security, we tax Social Security benefits for people earning above a certain amount. In Medicare now, just recently, the premiums that people pay are adjusted for the income that they have. We have a long way to go in means testing, but we've already started down that path.
So that is something that's just going to happen.
Almost definitely.
Yeah. Now, we've been skirting around this issue, but I think we should lock it in for our audience. What's the big ticket item, Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid?
No contest, it's Medicare.
Well,
it's Medicare and health care generally. Social Security is, we hear the numbers of an awesome multi-trillion-dollar deficit over the next 75 years. Keep in mind, however, that 75 years from now, the United States economy will be in the vicinity of $50 or more trillion a year. So it's not very big. Also, I would mention that the deficit in Social Security amounts to less than 2% of what we call the covered or taxed payrolls. That means that if we levy an increase of 1% each on employer and employees, that alone liquidates the Social Security deficit over the next 75 years.
Well, now I need to ask you to put your political science hat on.
Yeah.
If it's that easy, why ain't we done it?
My students tell me why. They don't believe that they will receive Social Security benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Why should we, as workers, pay for people who are retired? This is an intergenerational conflict which is being played out. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting statistic over here. Between 1935, when Social Security was established, and 1990, government raised Social Security tax rates more than a dozen times. Since 1990, they haven't been raised once. What's the difference? There's no political support among young people to tax them because they will be paying it for benefits that they don't expect to receive.
Well, there's another difference. I don't know whether it's 1990, but in the last 18 years, it's the case that the elderly are no longer the poorest among us.
That's correct, but partly because of Social Security.
Yes.
For half of the elderly, Social Security is the major source of income.
But therefore, I don't feel as much sympathy for the elderly. I don't want to raise what we give them. I don't want my taxes to go up because I know what the politicians will do. They'll raise the benefits, since I know they have now more money than the average family with children.
Well, That's true, and but now you're gliding into a separate issue, and that is, should we restructure the budget so that it does more for kids and for people in poverty rather than for the elderly?
Let's try to get to that in a minute, but let's go back to, so Social Security could be fixed, although, boy, the politicians sure enjoy, using it as a lever for this and that. What about Medicare?
Medicare is a totally different story. And the story revolves not only simply around what government is spending on Medicare, but what the country as a whole is spending on health services. Year after year, the cost of health services rises faster than either the price level or the gross domestic product of the United States, the economy. So what happens is we call this excess cost growth. Unless we deal with this excess cost growth in the economy as a whole, we cannot rein in Medicare costs.
And I know you want to talk about that, and the numbers are really quite striking. I saw a CBO estimate that says by the year 2015, which is not so far from here, 20% of everybody's income, 20, I guess that's the GDP percentage, will be spent on health care. So it's a big number.
Well, that's if we don't do anything.
Yes.
And I'm reminded of a famous line from the great economist Herbert Stein.
Dear friend.
If a trend cannot continue, it won't. And so that 20% will not materialize.
Well, see, that's what I wanted to ask you about this. I'm not so sure. For myself, I think I'd rather spend 20% on health care if I got my money's worth than on a larger house or a bigger car. Seems reasonable if I'm going to be more and more wealthy, which is what's happening, that I would spend it on health care.
Well, there's no doubt that as a society ages, it should and does spend more money on health services. Nothing wrong with that. What is wrong is simply the way health costs are rising so rapidly in the United States, even compared to other countries.
Because we don't think the decision is being made by you and me, right? The problem here is somebody else is spending this money and not necessarily in our interests.
Well, no, Americans have good thoughts about Medicare. They don't think it's wasteful money. People who participate in Medicare generally like the services, like the way their claims are processed, like the opportunity to go to the physician of their choice, and so on.
I understand that, but I suppose what I was trying to understand was, number one, well, let me ask you. You suggested, though, that there are some things that we should cut in our spending, that we're spending too much. Tell me some areas where we could cut spending in Medicare.
Well, in Medicare, we can cut spending by one aspect. It's not the whole story, but tightening up eligibility requirements, look at the areas of growth, look at the cost structure. Economists which have compared the United States to other countries and have asked the following question: why is health care twice as costly relative to GDP in the United States than most other developed countries? And the leading conclusion they have is not that we consume more services, not that we have more facilities or doctors or things like that, but we pay more for those services.
Oh, so you want to cut the incomes of doctors and nurses?
I think that's inevitable, and add pharmaceutical companies to that and other suppliers of health services.
You'll be very popular in
I'm
this
not
town.
saying I want to do it. I say it's going to happen.
Now, there was a little nick in payments to nurses. I don't know how large it was, but it couldn't have been much, because I don't believe the Congress ever does much of this. And yet the nurses did all these TV spots, and the Congress coweringly reversed all the cuts.
This is a scenario that replays itself every year, including in 2008. There's a provision of law which automatically cuts payments to providers based on
the providers
formula.
You think are being paid too much.
And then Congress intervenes and defers those cutbacks.
So they have a medical condition called cold feet.
Called politicalitis.
Yes, there you are. Where does the political leadership come from to change this?
It's going to be very hard. I think that it has to come from both parties. I think the president has to lead on this. The nature of Medicare and other tough decisions is that the job of the president, not the constitutional job, but the political job, is to make it easier for Congress to take hard decisions. And that hasn't happened recently. And any future president has to recognize that the president must shelter Congress by taking the lead.
Well, there's a sort of a gossip story in Washington that Clinton was prepared to take on both Social Security and Medicare. Is that right?
Well, the story is particularly with respect to Social Security. And he worked with Newt Gingrich, and they reached a tentative deal, and it blew up in their face in the Lewinsky scandal, and things unraveled afterwards.
Why did the Lewinsky business have anything to do with
Because the well was poisoned, the parties got polarized. Keep in mind, my assumption is to do anything significant in Social Security and Medicare requires the fingerprints of both parties, Republicans and Democrats. One party alone cannot get too out ahead of the other party.
So what was the deal that Clinton and Gingrich came up with, do you know?
Yeah, they would have raised taxes, cut benefits, provided for savings accounts, and it never happened.
Never happened. Well, you mentioned about leadership. Leadership matters. Political party matters too. So I'm going to ask you a two-part question about the plausible scenarios for reform for Medicare. One with a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress. So a plausible scenario for a long-term fix to Medicare with a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress. What's it look like, and how do we get there?
I think I'm going to surprise you by saying that the scenario won't differ very much whether a Democrat's in the White House or a Republican. That is, in the short term, there'll be differences, but if they're really focused on the long term, there has to be a package that leads to means testing that you mentioned earlier, that leads to tax increases, that is a greater flow of revenue into this sector. We can spend more on it, and that's why we need more revenue. Leads to cutbacks of certain payments, whether to pharmaceutical companies or providers or to insurance companies, and leads to some trimming of benefits. Keep in mind that virtually the entire package of benefits Medicare enacted in 1965 is still intact, plus additional benefits.
Plus $1 trillion or whatever for prescription drugs, too.
Well, it's $1 trillion over a period of years.
Yeah.
Okay. The funny thing is, Medicare is the most legislated program in Washington. Congress takes more actions on Medicare than any other sector. But when the dust settles, we've simply nibbled at the edges.
Okay, so that's the package.
Yeah.
I still haven't heard the political scenario that gets us there.
And that's much harder to imagine. The easy answer is to say things have to get worse before politicians tackle it. Keep in mind that Medicare is still paying its bills. The worst case scenario for the trust fund, the Medicare trust fund going dry, still has it running out another 10 years or more.
But every year we wait, the more difficult it.
That's true. Ideally, they should act now, but it wouldn't surprise me if they don't.
I want to stay on this topic because it's so troubling to me as an American citizen. I don't hear any voices raised within the Congress, within the executive about this sometimes. And that leads me to think that either the American people are getting just what they deserve, right, or what they want, which is a free lunch, or that the political system is so distorted that it's not giving us leadership.
Well, I think all of the above, but I'll add one thing. When we define Medicare as an entitlement, it's not only that citizens want it, they believe they're entitled to it. It's a right to it. And the predicament politicians face now is having taught Americans that they deserve Medicare. It's their money. They paid for it. Now we have to unteach them it. And that's a hard thing to do.
Well, your friend and mine, Alice Rivlin, has written that what we need is another Ross Perot.
Yeah. Well,
and she said with a squeaky voice and with the same little cards,
right,
to run for president because there's no other way to get the attention of the American people. And she says that it was his run that positioned Clinton and the Democrats to do the hard lifting that they did in 93?
Okay. Well, since Alice was president of the White House, I would take her account of it. But keep in mind that 3 years earlier, the first President Bush signed an even bigger package of tax increases and spending cuts than Clinton did.
Cost him his job.
And it cost him his job. Okay, so there can be circumstances that will force the hand of hands of politicians. The big difference between 1990 when Bush acted and 1993 when Clinton is not only that Clinton got reelected and Bush didn't, but Bush's involved Democrats and Republicans, and Clinton was almost entirely a Democratic initiative.
Well, I think he didn't get one Republican vote. I think that was the...
Yeah. That was the thing. He had to twist Democratic arms in order to get it through Congress.
And they made this tactical mistake, and they, as you and I know, there are often more votes available if they really need them in the Congress, but they let people off, and they made this giant, in my opinion, giant tactical mistake of moving this bill through on one vote. And therefore the Republicans were able to say, in every congressional district, this person was the deciding vote.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of reasons why the Republicans took advantage of how the Democrats behaved in 1993. And that leads to the following possible scenario.
Good.
If in 2009 the Democrats control Congress by a large majority and the White House as well, and push through a bold agenda, there's a good chance that they will pay a price at the polls in 2010.
When you say a bold agenda, you mean raise taxes big time.
Raise taxes big time and take some other actions, nibbling at the bits of this and that.
Yeah. Now, I saw an estimate. I don't remember whether it was yours. I don't think it was. I think it was with the Tax Association or whatever, that of the $380 billion deficit for next year, all of Obama's proposed tax hikes, and they're not very palatable to a lot of people, but all of them, taking them together, only get you about $70 billion towards that 380.
Yeah. Part of the reason is Obama would continue what we call the middle class tax cuts. So therefore, his dilemma is that while he wants to generate a lot of money, he's locked himself in a corner that can get it from somewhere between 1% to 10% of taxpayers. Mm-hmm. And even if you soak that portion of the taxpaying population, it's not going to generate enough.
By the way, people tell me that it's no longer possible to really soak that part of the population anymore because the globalization of financing is such that people can just change the way their financial profile. I don't know if that's true. Is that true?
No, it's really not true, because to the extent that global income is still taxable American income, so that if it's honestly reported, the fact that we have a global world diminishes the tax reach of Uncle Sam, but not all that much. No.
I'm struck by how we've talked about this as if some kind of reform is inevitable and has to happen. That would make this a very heartening conversation for me. Before we close, give me the worst case scenario.
The worst case scenario is that we don't do anything significant in the next few years. And so the easy situation is to do very little.
And let's go. So we often talk about these things as if it's just America. But as I think many of the people in our audience know, we're only able to do this deficit spending because someone's willing to loan us money. Now, some of it is Americans, but it's largely foreigners who are supporting our irresponsible ways. Now, I know everyone says, well, they could pull the plug. But can they, and how realistic is that?
They don't have to pull the plug to make things miserable for us. They simply don't have to write another blank check for us. There's all good reason to believe that foreign holders of American debt are not going to dump it, because doing so depreciates the value of their own assets. They are injuring themselves, whether it's China or Korea or Japan or any other country, if they dump American dollars. By the same token, they don't have to take on, they don't have to purchase all the additional American debt that they did in the past. And if that occurs, it gets harder and harder to finance the debt. And that might be a good thing, because some people have drawn the following conclusion. One of the reasons why the United States has such large deficits and has been willing to face the future is it doesn't have to. If people are willing to lend it money, why should it take hard decisions? It's only when it's harder to do so that we may steer the future more realistically.
I was going to say, this just sounds like my Uncle Jim, right? As long as he loans me money, I don't have to get a job, right? Or I don't have to live within my budget. So maybe the answer is that Ross Perot from Saudi Arabia or Ross Perot from wherever is the one who's going to slowly tighten the noose. Well, we'll have to come back to this issue next year, Alan Schick, and you'll have to tell us what happened after the first year of whichever new administration. Alan Schick, University of Maryland professor, thank you very much for being with us on Policy Watch.
Thank you, Doug.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.